Are we alone in the universe? A mere speck amongst the stars, waiting for a call back that we'll never receive? Or is there other life out there? And if there is, have they visited here? Well, according to the US government, yes. Actually, possibly yes. Apparently, according to the US government, aliens are real, and nobody cares. I mean, I get it with everything going on, but guys, for real, aliens? We're just gonna glaze over aliens? Let me see the saucers. Now, the best videos we're getting from the US government are just little black dots moving across the screen, but it still makes me wonder, what are we really looking at? And I believe seeing something in clear resolution can be the best way to understand it. And so you have to resort to man-made imagery that's faked. And the best you're gonna get is stuff that looks like the History Channel.
So is it possible that whoever visited our ancestors back in the day had these elongated skulls?
So I decided to do the deep dive of research into UFOs and aliens and find out what this stuff really looked like. Now, I want to stay as accurate as I can, but some creative liberties will have to be taken since this is only based on witness testimony, some blurry photographs, loose drawings, and other pieces of small evidence. But without any more hesitation, let's jump into our first case, shall we? On November 14th, 2004, Commander David Fravor, an experienced fighter pilot, set out with his team to investigate a possible target off the coast of Southern California. But immediately, David Fravor noticed that it was no longer popping up on their radars. And if you know anything about radars, that's pretty weird. When they finally arrived at the location, everything seemed to be mostly normal. It was clear blue skies, calm waters, and nothing seemed out of place, until they looked down and spotted a patch of white water shifting back and forth. When they got a closer look, they noticed that there was a pill-shaped object. They described this object as looking like a Tic Tac, hence the name, the Tic Tac UAP. They began to spin their planes down so they could match its altitude, but they started to notice it rise out of the water and rotate erratically. Eventually it met their altitude, and just as they were getting close enough to get a good look at it, it zipped off faster than they could possibly imagine. Now, this piece was the most simple to create. I knew down to very fine detail what the conditions and visuals of the encounter were. I knew what jets they were flying that day, the FA-18, and since modeling this myself would have taken way too long, longer than the rest of the piece, I decided to lean on a professional for this and buy an asset. I brought the model of the FA-18 into Blender, slapping on the textures and closing up the landing gears. I also imported a 3D model of a Navy pilot that I could put inside the jet because, as you might know, jets can't fly without people. That's called a drone. I placed the pilot into the cockpit and rotated his head so he looked distracted by what he was seeing. After all, if you saw a flying Tic Tac, I'm sure you'd be pretty distracted too. I duplicated the pilot, moving him to the other seat and adjusting the position just so it wasn't too similar to the first pilot. I rotated it, framed up my shot, and added a plane below to act as my ocean. I scaled it up, giving it a glossy material and adding a noise texture so it acted as the bumpy waves of the ocean. I also darkened the material, which reflected the sky and actually gave it a really natural oceanic color. But now it's time for the fun part, the Tic Tac UAP. And this part was so simple and it felt way too easy. That's kind of the problem with the UFO thing. A lot of these descriptions are really basic objects, which makes CGI look really fake. It's like adding a cube and calling your piece finished. It just feels wrong. But modeling it was easy enough. I just took 2 UV spheres, linked them together to create a pill shape, and then I modeled the little pegs on the bottom just using an edge with a skin modifier, adjusting its weight just a little bit so that it tapered off. So I gotta say I'm starting to understand why the History Channel graphics look as bad as they do. By creating a cube with a principled volume node and a noise texture to break up the density, I was really easily able to make 3D clouds that actually felt pretty real and added a ton of perspective to the scene. And the scene was starting to look not so bad, and now I could finally move on to compositing where I would add that final touch that would make the piece feel real and connected. I rendered out a mist pass, a pass with just the clouds, a plane pass, and a pass of each individual object in the scene, and this gave me a ton of freedom while editing within Photoshop. I started by bringing in the base render and just the separated element of the Tic Tac UAP, giving a little bit of motion blur just to feel the speed difference between it and the fighter jets that were pursuing it. Next, I brought in the mist pass, which is just a black and white image showing the distance of different objects throughout the scene. Using a mist pass allows you to sell the atmosphere in a scene. You can actually notice the effect in real life when you look at distant mountains as they get bluer and bluer the further away they are. After that, I was able to bring in my clouds pass, mixing it all together and overall giving the scene a lot more texture and depth. Now, all that was left was some color correction, some film grain, and a few other touch-ups, and I was able to call the piece finished. Now, while this scene was the easiest to create, I also felt challenged by the fact that there just wasn't much going on. Sometimes things aren't a spectacular light show or a one-on-one encounter with real aliens. Instead, it can be just a little thing that makes even experienced fighter pilots question everything that they know. But the next case I took on was a completely different story, one that defied all logic and all reason. On the night of November 5th, 1975, a crew of lumberjacks entered the Navajo County Police Station. Led by their boss, Michael H. Rogers, they all corroborated a truly wild story. Their friend and co-worker, Travis Walton, had been abducted, but not by anything of this earth. That night, as Travis Walton and his co-workers drove home, they noticed a strange light emanating from the forest. Pulling over to investigate, Travis Walton couldn't help himself, jumped out of the car, and pursued the light. But when he got too close, it shocked him with a bright flash of energy, and he was knocked unconscious. His friends, terrified by what they had just seen, drove off, leaving him behind. When Travis awoke, injured and afraid, he found himself lying on a table surrounded by 3 small gray beings with large black eyes. Naturally, out of fear, he lashed out at these beings, but they didn't fight back and instead left him to his own devices. And when he decided to leave the room, he ended up coming across another human, but this was no ordinary person. They were wearing a blue jumpsuit and a domed helmet, and seemed to be overly pleasant with him. The man led him out into a hangar full of the same saucers he spotted in the woods. And on the other side of the room were 2 other beings with the same outfits and domed helmets. And this is what I wanted to focus on creating. Unlike most stories where it's a small dot or a flying saucer off in the distance, this was a truly close-up case and was an example of a much larger craft than we're used to hearing about. Starting off with the overall shape of the hangar, I created a cylinder, rotating it to its side and deleting the bottom. And I filled out the bottom half of the cylinder to create a floor. I scaled it up so that it was just about the right scale, even though we don't have solid reports on just how big the hangar was. I duplicated the cylinder and created a smaller shape out of it, scaling it down so that it acted as a column against the wall. I put an array modifier on this and stretched it out all the way across the hangar. This was again going along with cases of what most UFOs looked like, including the curved architecture and there really being no seam lines to the creation of these objects. I also decided to make it a little bit more interesting by having the cylinder cap off as a UV sphere. Now, this wouldn't be a hangar full of flying saucers without, you guessed it, flying saucers. And luckily I didn't have to do too much guesswork, considering that there are drawings made of what these saucers actually looked like according to Travis. I started off with a UV sphere, flattening it down to that classic saucer shape. I added a subdivision surface to the saucer, using the crease tool to sharpen some edges along its shape. I also added some extra caps and struts to the top and bottom of the saucer just to give it a little extra detail, considering that the drawings given by Travis were a little loose. But now I needed landing gears for the saucers since they weren't currently flying. I'm not too sure if this fits his description, but again, I wanted to take creative liberties with this, considering that saucers lying flat down seems a little unnatural to me. For the landing gears, I stuck with a curved natural shape and used cylinders to create the joints. Again, trying not to give anything too much of a man-made feel. Nothing has grooves or rivets in any of the descriptions. I put the saucers on an array, shifting them off to the side and mirroring them to the other side of the hangar. Another really interesting description that Travis Walton gave was the materials that made up the hangar that he found himself in. He described most of the walls and floors as being a smooth gray texture, but when you would walk closer, they would actually illuminate the stars outside of the walls. Using this idea, I decided to make the back of the hangar illuminate with the cosmos beyond, adding it to the dome and painting it on as an emissive material. In Photoshop, I created a white circle on a black image. This acted as a mask that I could slap on as an image texture onto the bottom plane of the platform and helped act as another light source. I also went about duplicating another saucer, adding it to the center of my scene, and placing a spot lamp above it. Now, while the environment was described as perfectly clean, smooth, and matte gray, I decided to add some gloss to the floor and surface imperfections to every surface. Now came the table that Travis was laid upon before waking up back in the woods. I followed a slightly different design theory, adding a cube and modeling a small point that it all leaned on, just to give it almost a levitating feel and still stick to that form and function of something not made by humans. I used that same piece, duplicated and flipped over and scaled up, just to create an overall hanging levitating piece that could emanate light down onto the table below. And almost forgetting a huge step, I added some materials of the saucers, giving them both a gold and a bluish gray metallic texture. Next, I added some volumetric fog. I also added a noise texture to the fog just to give it that cloudy feel the same way I did in the Tic Tac UAP, but I made it a lot more subtle. But the massive scale described by Travis Walton can't truly be felt without characters within the scene. And the strange people in domed helmets and blue jumpsuits was one of the most intriguing parts about the case, so I knew I had to create that next. Now, finding the right character was pretty difficult, so I ended up settling on the car crash dummy from the Mixamo library. I had to repaint the jumpsuit from orange to blue and painted off the textures off the cheeks of the model, but after adding a domed helmet to it in Blender and posing it correctly, it looked pretty good. And the details also didn't matter too much considering that these characters are going to be so small in such a massive scene, so it ended up working pretty well. I reframed my shot just so it was more centered and a little bit more interesting compositionally, and I rendered out my base pass, miss pass, and was ready to move into Photoshop for compositing. Now, compositing this was the same as the previous piece with even less steps. I just had to color correct, add some film overlays, and as a final touch, I used the dodge tool to highlight certain parts of the piece that I wanted to pop out. And after that, I called the piece finished. Now, while the first piece was easy to create, this one was a lot harder. Trying to recreate such abstract imagery from somebody who described their state as being pretty catatonic at the time was very difficult, and honestly, I didn't know exactly where to go with this. And to me, it doesn't feel right to take too many creative liberties, but when you only have so much of a description, you can only go off of that. But something that goes against reality does just that. It goes against reality. So we have to use our frame of reference to create what might have been seen. But the next case, I feel, brings together both the real and the strange. And it might be a case you've heard of before. In fact, it's the case that started all of this. On September 19th, 1961, Betty and Barney Hill were on their way to return home from a vacation in Niagara Falls. They eventually observed an odd light moving through the sky, pulling over to observe it better. At first thinking it was a falling star, they eventually got back in their car and continued traveling home. Soon they started to notice that the light was moving closer, maybe even following them. It continued to pursue them and descended rapidly upon their car, causing them to pull over in the middle of the highway. Barney Hill exited the car, approaching the saucer cautiously, wielding the gun that he had brought with him. Barney looked up to notice windows where three beings were staring down at them, and the only way he could describe them was as being not human. They didn't remember much after that, and it wouldn't be until much later in many hypnotherapy sessions that they would actually discover what really happened that night. But this moment is the one that I decided on to create this piece. The two of them, out on a dark road, all alone, facing down something that seemed to be not of this earth. I started off by finding a model of the car that Betty and Barney Hill were driving that night, the Gaz 12 Zim. I went with a lower poly model, figuring that it was going to be out of focus even though it was in the foreground, and that I could get away with a little less detail. I brought the car into Blender and added a small orange light to act as the interior light, and also added some lamps to create the headlights and a red emissive texture to act as the taillights. With the car prepped, I used a plane to model the bend of the road that they were on, and quickly added another plane below it to act as the overall terrain. Onto the road, I mapped a street texture, and I fixed up the UV and added some thickness to the road. After that, I created a collection of trees using the Botanique add-on, and used them as the render objects of a hair particle I placed on my terrain. I used weight painting to affect the density of the trees, making sure that they didn't pop up anywhere that was off camera or on top of the road. But now it's time for the best part, the flying saucer. This one was even easier than the other vehicles because this one also has a ton of drawings around it. I started off by modeling a large cylinder, placing it where I wanted it to appear and scaling it to the actual size described by Betty and Barney Hill. I first modeled out the basic shape in low poly, adding a subdivision surface to smooth everything out. I modeled raised sections out the bottom and top of the craft just to add a little bit of thickness, and added panels that went all the way around the window section. To the bottom of the craft, I added a hole where I could have light emanating out from the bottom, just like the classic saucers you've heard about in folklore. I modeled some struts for the bottom of the saucer and added a plane to be my emissive texture that would actually emanate from the bottom of the craft. To the inside of the craft, I added another cylinder, adding a high-rise window texture to it and giving it an emissive material source. I adjusted the UV mapping just so it added some detail, also giving it a bluish-green tint to match the emissive source on the bottom of the ship. I adjusted the lighting in the volumetric fog, and added some images of mists and clouds just to act as PNG plates to help add depth to the scene. As the final detail, I added some grass, again weight painting it so it didn't appear on the road. I rendered out all of my passes and moved back into Photoshop. Once again, the compositing was pretty straightforward. I just color corrected, added some film grain overlays, and also added a lens flare just to help really create that center focal point of the saucer. And with that, my final piece was finished. So out of all three pieces, this one had to be my favorite to create. I felt really connected to a normal night driving down the road and coming across something that you couldn't even believe. Also, getting to create a ship that seemed to have more function to it and not just being a Tic Tac was a lot more exciting to work on. And the coolest thing about this is one of the first UFO encounters and abductions ever documented. And it set off this entire mythos that we still love today. So if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe, and let me know below if you want to see me make this a whole series, because there's a lot more cases I could cover, and I'd be more than happy to do this again. Also, if you want to download all the files I use to create these, go check out my Patreon, where I put a ton of assets in all of my scenes so you can pick them apart and source them for your own artwork. But as usual, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.